The PBY Catalina looked obsolete the day the war began. That is not a retrospective judgment. It was the assessment of every pilot who transitioned into one from a more modern aircraft, of every naval analyst who compared its specifications to what Germany and Japan were putting in the air, and of every aviation journalist who got close enough to one to notice that it cruised at 125 miles per hour in a war where fighters were exceeding 400. A parasol wing flying boat with two radial engines mounted above a marine hull, designed in 1933, entering production in 1935, flying combat operations in 1941 against the most capable naval air forces the world had ever built. The Catalina looked like exactly what it was, a design whose moment should have passed before the conflict it was now being asked to decide. The Japanese Navy that attacked Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, understood this. Japanese planners had factored American PBY patrol coverage into their attack planning, specifically the gap in that coverage, the 700-mile sector north of Oahu, where the Catalinas were not flying that morning, that the strike force transited to reach its launch point undetected. They had studied the Catalina's performance specifications, understood its limitations, and decided it was not a significant tactical threat to fast surface forces or fighter-escorted strike packages. They were correct about the specifications. They were catastrophically wrong about what the aircraft would do with them. Between December 1941 and August 1945, PBY Catalinas flew operations that changed the course of the war in the Pacific and kept it winnable in the Atlantic. A Catalina crew spotted the Japanese fleet at Midway and transmitted the contact report that allowed the American carrier force to position for the battle that turned the Pacific War. Catalina crews sank or assisted in sinking 39 confirmed German U-boats in the Atlantic, directly reducing the submarine campaign that threatened to sever Britain's supply line. Catalinas rescued approximately 3,000 downed airmen from Pacific waters, men who flew again, in aircraft that made more difference to the war's outcome than the fuel and ordnance the rescue missions consumed would have produced in any alternative use. Allied Catalinas flew in every theater from the Arctic to the Coral Sea, in every role from mine-laying to troop transport to the night anti-shipping operations that the Black Cat program produced, and accumulated a strategic record that no aircraft of comparable performance specifications had any right to have produced. Understanding why requires understanding what the Catalina actually was, not what its specification sheet described, but what the combination of its specific capabilities, its operational flexibility, and the specific requirements of the war that actually materialized allowed it to accomplish. Start with the characteristic that every other aircraft the Navy had in 1941 lacked and that the war immediately demonstrated was indispensable: endurance. The PBY-5. A Catalina carried 1,750 gallons of fuel in tanks mounted in the wing. At cruise power, the setting that maximized range rather than speed, her two Pratt & Whitney R1 twin Wasp engines, each consuming approximately 55 gallons per hour, produced a fuel burn that gave the aircraft a maximum range of 2,520 miles. At the patrol speeds and altitudes that the anti-submarine mission required, with the fuel reserves that operational doctrine specified for search pattern flexibility, the practical patrol endurance was between 18 and 24 hours of continuous flight. 18 to 24 hours. No land-based patrol aircraft available to the United States Navy in 1941 matched this endurance. The Lockheed Hudson that equipped the early Atlantic patrol squadrons had a range of approximately 2,160 miles in its most favorable configuration, and a patrol endurance substantially less. The consolidated B-24 Liberator, modified as the PB-4Y Liberator patrol bomber that eventually supplemented the Catalina in the Atlantic, had greater speed and heavier armament, but initially less patrol endurance in its early production variants. The Catalina's endurance was not an accident of design. It was the product of a flying boat hull that could carry the large fuel load without the structural penalties that a land-based aircraft of equivalent capacity would have imposed, and of a cruise speed low enough that the fuel burn rate produced hours of patrol time that faster aircraft with the same fuel simply could not match. In the Atlantic in 1942, the strategic problem that mattered most was the mid-ocean gap. the area of the central Atlantic that shore-based aircraft from North America, Iceland, and Britain could not reach with sufficient patrol endurance to be operationally useful. This gap, roughly 600 miles wide in its narrowest dimension in 1942, was where the U-boat force operated with complete freedom from air attack. Aircraft could not reach it. The U-boats could concentrate there, attack convoys, and withdraw without any aerial threat to their surface operations. German submarine commanders called it the Black Pit and regarded it as the campaign's most favorable operating area. The Catalina's endurance allowed it to reach into this gap from bases in Iceland and Newfoundland at ranges that shorter-ranged aircraft could not achieve. It could not cover the entire gap from any single base. The geometry of range did not permit it. But it could cover the outer edges of the gap in ways that compressed the area of complete freedom from aerial observation that the U-boats depended on. Every mile of the gap that Catalina patrols could reach was a mile where a surfaced U-boat risked detection and attack, and the U-boat's fundamental operational requirement, time on the surface to recharge batteries, to ventilate the boat, to transit at the higher speeds that surface running permitted, was constrained by aerial surveillance in direct proportion to how much of its operating area that surveillance covered. The Catalina did not close the mid-ocean gap. Very long-range land-based aircraft and escort carriers eventually closed it in 1943. What the Catalina did was constrain it from the edges and, in doing so, demonstrate with operational data the strategic value of patrol endurance that the subsequent Very Long-Range Aircraft program used as its foundational argument for the resources required to build those aircraft and extend their range to cover the full gap. The Atlantic numbers are specific and they belong here. Between 1942 and 1944, Catalinas from VP squadrons operating in the Atlantic and its adjacent waters participated in attacks on 107 U-boats. Of those, 39 were confirmed sunk by Catalina attack alone or by Catalina attack in combination with surface vessels. Another 31 were damaged sufficiently to require return to base for repair, removing them from the operational cycle for periods measured in weeks. The remaining 37 attacks produced insufficient damage assessment to assign a confirmed result. 39 confirmed kills. In a campaign where sinking a U-boat saved on average 86,000 tons of Allied shipping from destruction, based on the average sinkings per U-boat operational deployment across the Atlantic campaign, 39 sinkings represent approximately 3.35 million tons of shipping preserved. The Catalinas that sank those 39 submarines did so with aircraft that cost approximately $90,000 each in 1942 dollars, and that consumed fuel at a rate that made them expensive to operate by patrol aviation standards. The shipping they preserved, measured in the replacement cost of the vessels themselves and the irreplaceable value of the war material they were carrying, was worth orders of magnitude more than the aircraft and fuel that produced the result. The Pacific Theater produced the Catalina's most famous single moment of effectiveness in the first 6 months of the war, and it is worth examining in specific detail because the moment illustrates exactly what the aircraft's capabilities produced when they were applied to the strategic situation the war had created. On the morning of June 3, 1942, Ensign Jack Reed of VP-44, flying a PBY-5 Catalina on a search patrol from Midway Island, acquired a surface contact at approximately 0904 local time at a range of roughly 700 miles from Midway. The contact was the main body of the Japanese invasion fleet bound for Midway, the transports and supporting warships that constituted the logistical component of Operation MI. The Japanese planned to seize Midway and thereby extend the defensive perimeter that would force the American fleet into the climactic engagement the Japanese naval strategy required. Reed transmitted his contact report. The report reached Midway and was relayed to Admiral Nimitz at Pearl Harbor. The information it contained, the position, course, and speed of the Japanese invasion force, confirmed that the Japanese attack on Midway was imminent and allowed the American carrier force, already positioned northeast of Midway based on prior intelligence, to confirm their tactical assessment and refine their positioning for the engagement. This was not the contact that found the Japanese carrier force. That contact was made on June 4th by another Catalina crew and confirmed the carrier's position, allowing the decisive dive-bombing attack to be launched. But June 3rd's contact gave the American command 24 additional hours of confirmed intelligence about Japanese intentions and force composition that shaped every decision Admiral Spruance made on June 4th. A Catalina crew flying a routine search patrol from an island base produced the intelligence that initiated the intelligence chain leading to Midway. They were flying a search pattern at 125 miles per hour in an aircraft that the Japanese had decided was not a significant tactical threat, over waters the Japanese believed were beyond useful American aerial patrol range. The Catalina's endurance put it at the range where Reed found what he found. The Japanese planners had not adequately accounted for what 18-hour patrol endurance allowed American patrol squadrons to cover. The rescue mission that the Catalina performed throughout the Pacific War is the dimension of its effectiveness that the strategic analyses tend to undervalue and that the specific operational record makes most compelling when examined at the level of individual men and individual missions. The calculus of the rescue mission is not complicated, but it requires being stated explicitly to reveal its full implications. A carrier pilot represented an investment of approximately $75,000 in 1942 dollars for his training alone. The flight hours, the instructors, the aircraft used in training, the administrative and logistical support of the training pipeline. Beyond the dollar figure, a carrier pilot with 12 months of combat experience represented a form of human capital that no training program could quickly replicate. The specific situational awareness, the tactical judgment, the aircraft handling skills that only combat flying develops. A combat experienced carrier pilot was worth more to the war effort on June 5, 1942, than the training system could produce in any period shorter than 12 months, even if it redirected every available resource to doing so. When a carrier pilot ditched in the Pacific, the question of whether he was recovered or lost was not a humanitarian question separate from the war's strategic mathematics. It was a strategic question with a specific answer. Recovery meant the man flew again. Loss meant the training pipeline had to produce a replacement from a pool of trainees whose combat experience was zero. In a Pacific air campaign where the quality differential between experienced and inexperienced pilots expressed itself directly in kill ratios and mission effectiveness, the recovery of experienced airmen was a strategic investment whose return was calculable. The Catalina was the primary instrument of that recovery. Between December 1941 and August 1945, Catalina crews rescued approximately 3,000 downed airmen and other survivors from Pacific waters. The true figure is higher. Many rescues were not formally documented in the operational confusion of frontline operations, but the documented 3,000 represents the lower bound of the Catalina's rescue contribution. 3,000 men, recovered from the Pacific, returned to combat. Against the training cost of replacing those men, minimum 12 months per replacement, with the cascade effects of experienced pilot loss on squadron effectiveness during the replacement period. The fuel and aircraft and crew hours the rescue missions consumed were among the most productive investments the Navy made in any category of Pacific air operations. The specific mechanics of how a Catalina rescue actually worked reveal why no other aircraft available to the Navy could have produced these results. A carrier pilot who ditched after a strike was in the Pacific in a life raft, or a Mae West life jacket at a position that might be 200 miles from the nearest land and 100 miles from the nearest friendly surface vessel. In 1942, and much of 1943, submarine rescue was theoretically available but practically limited. A submarine could not always be positioned to respond, and could not always surface safely in contested waters. Destroyers and destroyer escorts could conduct rescue operations, but could not be routinely detached from convoy escort or carrier screening to search 100-mile areas of open ocean. The Catalina could search. It could fly the search pattern at 125 miles per hour for 18 hours if necessary, covering the area systematically, using radar to detect life rafts that the human eye could not find in open ocean swells. When it found the survivor, it could land. This was the capability no other American aircraft of comparable range possessed. A 4-engine patrol aircraft with greater speed and longer range than the Catalina could find the survivor. It could not land beside him and take him aboard. It could drop additional survival equipment and mark the position for a surface vessel that might be hours away. the Catalina could land and take the man out of the water immediately. Landing in open ocean was not a casual capability. It was a demanding, sometimes dangerous act that the Catalina's hull design made possible and that no land plane design of the era could replicate. The flying boat hull provided the buoyancy, the hydrodynamic stability on the water surface, and the structural strength to survive the deceleration, loads of open ocean landing that the operation required. The crew that landed beside a downed airman in Pacific swells was using a capability that the Catalina's design had provided, and that the alternative aircraft of the period simply did not have. The Black Cat program that the Catalina's Pacific crews developed from operational necessity represents the aircraft's most remarkable demonstration of effectiveness, because it converted an aircraft whose slowness and low altitude ceiling made it tactically vulnerable in daylight into a weapon whose specific characteristics, its low speed, its quiet approach, profile relative to faster aircraft, its ability to carry radar and operate at low altitude for extended periods, made it uniquely suited to night anti-shipping operations in the conditions the Solomon Islands campaign produced. The conversion was not ordered from above. It was improvised by the crews themselves, beginning in the Philippines in December 1941, when the aircraft's daylight vulnerability to Japanese fighters became clear in the first weeks of operations. The Black Cat crews who painted their Catalinas non-specular black, stripped unnecessary equipment to extend endurance, and began flying exclusively at night against Japanese coastal shipping were not following a doctrine that had been written for them. They were creating one from the operational reality they were living inside. The doctrine they created was, in retrospect, exactly correct for the tactical situation the campaign required it to address. Japanese coastal shipping in the Solomons operated primarily at night, hugging the coastline of islands where daytime air attack made open water transit suicidal. Japanese barge traffic, the shallow draft motorized landing craft that the Imperial Army used to supply island garrisons after destroyers became too vulnerable to commit to the supply runs, moved at night in coastal waters too shallow and too close to terrain for effective attack by faster, higher-flying aircraft. The Black Cat Catalina could fly slow enough to identify and engage small coastal targets that faster aircraft passed before the attack geometry could be established. It could carry radar capable of detecting coastal shipping at ranges that darkness made visually undetectable. It could carry the Mark 13 aerial torpedo in addition to bombs and depth charges, giving it weapons options against different target categories that the mission might present. And it could do all of this for 6 to 8 hours in the target area, returning to base before dawn, a sustained presence over the target area that no faster aircraft could achieve within the fuel constraints of the distances involved. Black Cat crews in the Solomon Islands, the Philippines, and the approaches to Japan documented anti-shipping results that were verified in post-war analysis of Japanese shipping losses. Dozens of barges destroyed, coastal freighters sunk, supply shipments interdicted, garrison resupply operations disrupted at a rate that the Japanese logistical system, already strained by the accelerating pace of American offensive operations, could not compensate for. The versatility of the Catalina across operational roles is the characteristic that appears in every assessment of the aircraft's effectiveness, and that is most easily said without being fully understood in its strategic implications. A navy that acquired PBY Catalinas in 1941 acquired a single airframe that could perform anti-submarine patrol in the Atlantic, search reconnaissance in the Pacific, mine-laying in the Aleutians, rescue operations in every theater, night anti-shipping strikes in the Southwest Pacific, and transport operations across all theaters, frequently with the same aircraft modified between missions by changing the ordnance load and the crew configuration. The procurement economics of this versatility are significant. A single aircraft type that can perform 8 different operational roles requires a single spare parts supply chain, a single maintenance training program, a single operational crew training syllabus. The administrative and logistical savings of operating a versatile platform rather than 8 specialized platforms of equivalent total capability are not captured in the performance specification comparisons that make the Catalina look slow and outdated, but they are real, and they were strategically meaningful in a war where every industrial and logistical resource was being demanded by multiple competing priorities simultaneously. The specific engagement that illustrates the Black Cat program's effectiveness in its most concentrated form occurred on the night of July 25, 1943, in the waters off New Georgia in the Central Solomons. Lieutenant Commander Bruce Harwood, commanding officer of VP-12, was leading a Black Cat strike against Japanese barge traffic in the New Georgia Sound. His aircraft was carrying 2 Mark 47 depth charges and 4 100-pound bombs. In the mixed ordnance configuration that the Black Cat mission profile used for flexible engagement of various target types. His radar operator, aviation radio man, First Class James Carlisle of Columbus, Ohio, acquired a surface contact at approximately 22:30 local time at a range of 4 miles, small, moving slowly along the coastline, consistent with the barge traffic pattern that the previous week's operations had established. Harwood descended to 200 feet, switched off all aircraft lights, and made his approach on the radar contact in total darkness. The Catalina's approach speed of 115 knots gave the radar operator 90 seconds from initial visual acquisition range to release point to refine the contact's position, course, and speed. Carlisle maintained the track, providing continuous updates. At 600 yards, Harwood acquired the contact visually, a string of 4 Japanese barges moving in column, each carrying approximately 60 soldiers and 10 tons of supplies for the New Georgia garrison. The attack that followed expended 2 depth charges and 2 100-pound bombs. 3 of the 4 barges were sunk or heavily damaged. The 4th beached on the coastline rather than risk further exposure in open water. The 200-odd soldiers and the supplies that the 3 sunk barges were carrying did not reach New Georgia. The action report for this engagement occupies half a page of the VP-12 operational log. It records the contact, the attack geometry, the ordnance expended, and the damage assessment. It does not record what 200 soldiers and 10 tons of supplies would have meant to the New Georgia garrison's ability to resist the Marine landings then in progress. That calculation belongs to the operational analysis rather than the action report, but it is present in the action report's facts. The supplies and the men carrying them did not arrive, and the garrison they were supposed to reinforce could not hold without them, and the New Georgia campaign ended in American control of an island that controlled the approaches to Bougainville and ultimately the approach to Rabaul. 1 aircraft, 1 crew, 1 night mission, 1 engagement in a campaign of thousands. The strategic weight of the individual action is not in the action itself, but in the accumulation, in the dozens of similar engagements across the same period, the cumulative effect of sustained night interdiction by a force of aircraft that the Japanese planners had not adequately accounted for when they designed the supply system the garrisons depended on. The Catalina at Midway did not win the battle. The dive bombers won Midway. But the Catalina found the fleet and transmitted the contact report that allowed the dive bombers to find it at the right moment. The Catalina in the Atlantic did not win the Battle of the Atlantic. Better convoy organization, escort carriers, very long-range aircraft, and signals intelligence won the Battle of the Atlantic. But the Catalina extended patrol coverage into ranges that compressed the gap where the U-boats operated freely, and its crews killed 39 submarines that would otherwise have continued sinking ships for the months until improved capabilities arrived. The Catalina at Okinawa did not defeat the kamikaze campaign. Combat air patrols and radar pickets defeated the kamikaze campaign, but Catalinas rescued the airmen that the campaign was consuming, returning them to the fighter squadrons that needed experienced pilots to fly the cap that stopped kamikazes before they reached the fleet. The Catalina was effective because it was available everywhere the war required presence, for long enough to actually be present rather than briefly passing through, at a cost the production system could sustain, in a configuration that the crews could adapt to whatever the specific operational situation required. Operated by men who understood what the aircraft could do and who had demonstrated, from the Philippines to the Arctic to the South Atlantic to the night waters of the slot, that what it could do was more than its specifications had promised and more than the aircraft's adversaries had planned for. The last Catalina combat patrol of the war flew on August 14, 1945, the day before Japan's surrender was announced. The patrol was a routine anti-submarine sweep in the Western Pacific. It found nothing and returned to base, and the crew was told the war was over. The aircraft had been doing this for 1,347 days, from December 8, 1941 to August 14, 1945. In every ocean the war had touched. One of the pilots who flew Catalina patrols from the beginning of the Pacific War to near its end was Lieutenant Commander Howard Alden of VP-11 from Portland, Maine, who completed 127 patrol missions between December 1941 and June 1945 in 4 different theaters: the Philippines, the Southwest Pacific, the Central Pacific, and the North Atlantic, where he rotated for a 6-month assignment in 1943 before returning to the Pacific. Alden retired from the Navy in 1957 at the rank of commander. He worked for 22 years as a harbor pilot in Portland, guiding large commercial vessels through the approaches to Portland Harbor, a job that used the specific water reading and meteorological judgment that years of Catalina operations had built into a skill set the harbor pilot's work required. He retired from harbor piloting in 1979. He died in 1991 at the age of 73. His son, in an account written for a Maine Maritime Museum retrospective in 1998, described asking his father what had made the Catalina effective when, by every measure, it should have been inadequate for what the war required of it. His father thought about this for a long time. Then he said it was because the aircraft did not lie to you about what it was. He said fast aircraft told you they were fast, and you believed it. And then you tried to use the speed, and sometimes the speed was not enough. He said the Catalina was slow on the specification sheet and slow in the air, and the crews knew it was slow, and so they learned to use what it actually had, which was time. Time over the water, time searching, time finding, time that faster aircraft had already used to get somewhere else. He said the war turned out to need time over the water more than it needed speed getting there. He said he thought about this a great deal in his harbor pilot years. He said bringing a large vessel into a harbor required patience and the willingness to be slow in the right place rather than fast in the wrong one. He said the Catalina had taught him this distinction. He said it was one of the more useful things he had learned.